The sky over the kingdom was heavy with gray clouds, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The castle, magnificent and imposing, rose against the storm, its golden spires glinting faintly in the muted sunlight. Inside, corridors echoed with whispers. Ancient walls that had heard decades of secrets now trembled with the anticipation of a new arrival. Prince Elias, young and earnest, stood at the grand entrance hall, his fingers brushing the intricate patterns of his robe. His eyes, bright and searching, held a kind of quiet longing, a yearning for something real, something beyond the weight of expectation. Today, the bride promised by alliance and duty would arrive, and with her, perhaps, a spark that might awaken the heart he had kept so guarded. When the carriage wheels finally clattered into the hall, the staff hushed. From the shadows of the doorway emerged a figure so delicate and silent that the air seemed to shift around her. She was small, with pale skin that almost glowed under the dim chandeliers. Her eyes, deep and unreadable, flicked once toward the prince before dropping, refusing engagement. Her hands clutched a small bundle of personal belongings, and though she moved carefully, every step seemed measured, deliberate, like a dance of fragility. The attendants hurried to offer food, silver plates of roasted meats, fruits that gleamed like jewels, and sweet pastries that perfumed the air, but she did not touch them. A hush fell over the room. Some servants whispered of curses, others speculated about illness or hidden sorrow. The air became thick with tension, fascination, and fear. The prince approached her slowly, hands open, voice soft and welcoming. Yet even he could not coax her to eat. Though her lips remained tight and her gaze averted, there was something in the tilt of her head, in the tremor of her fingers, that suggested a past cloaked in pain. It was a story she had not yet shared, a truth she carried like a fragile glass vial she dared not let anyone touch. And yet, despite the silence and distance, something in the prince's chest stirred, a mixture of curiosity, concern, and an inexplicable pull toward the enigma before him. The hall settled into uneasy stillness. The bride's eyes, for the briefest of moments, seemed to reflect both the weight of her own secrets and the possibility of something unspoken, waiting to bloom between them. Days passed, but the bride remained as elusive as the morning mist. The palace, with its grandeur and glittering halls, became a maze of careful observation. Every meal she avoided, every ceremony she attended in silence, sent ripples of worry through the servants and nobles alike. She would sit at the table, a picture of fragile grace, her plate untouched, her fork idle as others ate in murmured conversation. Prince Elias watched from a distance, torn between frustration and a deepening empathy. How could someone so delicate possess such a steel-like resistance? Each glance she cast toward him seemed to measure him, judge him, yet never fully reveal herself. He tried kindness, small gestures, gifts of flowers, gentle words, but each effort was met with polite restraint or quiet withdrawal. Still, he returned each day, unshaken in his desire to understand her. The castle buzzed with speculation. Some whispered that she was bewitched, others feared she carried a terrible secret, while a few pitied her with thinly veiled sympathy. But behind the gossip, a truth waited, hidden in the corners of the palace, like dust settling over a forgotten diary. At night, when the candles flickered low, the bride wandered alone through the echoing halls or lingered in the quiet gardens, her hands tracing patterns in the soil or over the petals of roses. Occasionally, she would sit by the fountain, staring at her reflection with eyes that spoke of isolation and fear. Through these moments, glimpses of her past flickered in her memory, a lonely childhood in a distant house where laughter was rare, where every smile had a price, and betrayal had left marks deeper than any visible wound. Prince Elias sensed the weight she carried. He saw the trembling of her hands, the pause before she answered, the way her gaze darted away when eyes lingered too long. He began to understand that her refusal to eat was not mere stubbornness. It was a shield, a protective barrier against a world that had already hurt her too much. Yet, in the quiet moments between duties, he found opportunities for connection. A small hand offered in silence, a brush of fingertips over hers while passing in the garden, a shared look over the court's proceedings, all gestures that spoke of care and patience. Slowly, unspoken understanding began to grow, a fragile thread between two hearts, tethered by curiosity, respect, and the faintest hint of hope. Still, the tension lingered. The bride's presence was a puzzle wrapped in sorrow, her every action a whisper of untold stories. The palace watched, waited, and whispered, but only one person seemed willing to look beyond the silence, to seek the fragile truth hidden beneath the surface. And in that pursuit, both prince and bride would find themselves drawn into a journey neither had anticipated, a journey of trust, revelation, and the delicate awakening of a bond that might heal the deepest of wounds. The days stretched on, heavy with unspoken questions. The palace remained beautiful, grand, and opulent. But within its walls, a storm of emotion and mystery had begun to take root, promising change that would ripple far beyond the gilded halls. The days in the castle had grown long, each one stretching like a shadow over Prince Elias's heart. The bride remained as silent as a ghost, her pale figure drifting through the gilded halls and quiet gardens, always just out of reach. Concern gnawed at the prince. Frustration and helplessness mingled with an unspoken fear for her fragile health. The palace council called in doctors and advisors, hoping to uncover a medical reason for her refusal to eat. Physicians examined her, their hands gentle but probing. Yet no illness could explain the emptiness in her gaze, the thin lines of her wrists, or the way she recoiled from their questions. The advisors suggested remedies and treatments, some subtle, some drastic, but each attempt seemed to push her further into silence. Elias could not stand by and watch. He began to seek answers himself, trailing her quietly through the gardens, the libraries, and the moonlit halls. He noticed her small routines, the way she traced patterns in the dust with her fingers, the careful stacking of books and papers in hidden corners, the hurried scratching of words in a leather-bound journal he had once glimpsed. She wrote, he realized, not to share but to release, as if ink could carry away what her lips could not say. In the quiet of the palace's oldest library, Elias discovered hints of her past. A folded letter slipped between pages of a dusty book, the handwriting delicate and trembling, speaking of fear, isolation, and a home she had long left behind. A small, worn locket revealed a portrait of a young girl alone in a sunlit room, a room empty but for shadows. Each discovery painted a fragment of her story, and yet the full truth remained veiled, a ghost hiding behind a fragile smile and averted eyes. Suspicion began to curl through the palace like smoke. Some wondered if her silence was defiance, a subtle rebellion against the prince or the kingdom. Others whispered of curses or spirits, of mystical forces that might have bound her appetite and speech. But Elias saw something different. He saw a deep, aching pain, one he could neither fix nor ignore, yet could not help but pursue. At night, he would sometimes find her by the hidden fountain in the garden, water shimmering beneath the moonlight. She sat, knees drawn to her chest, hands trembling over a sketch she had drawn in charcoal. It was dark and haunting, twisted shapes, a broken tree, and a figure of a small girl reaching toward an empty doorway. Elias knelt a few feet away, not daring to speak, yet wishing to bridge the silence. Slowly, her fingers traced the water's edge, and he dared to think that maybe, in these quiet moments, she allowed him to witness a sliver of her inner world. Days turned into weeks. Every subtle clue, the journal entries, the letters, the sketches, revealed the edges of a life filled with loss and fear. Betrayal had carved deep scars. Trust had been a rare gift, one that had been cruelly taken away. And yet, Elias refused to give up. He believed that the bride's silence was not stubbornness, it was survival, and within it, a fragile hope waiting for someone patient enough to see. The palace staff, growing restless, began to notice Elias's persistence. Some supported him, admiring his patience and empathy. Others whispered that his concern had gone too far, that he risked both his heart and his throne for a mystery that might never be solved. But the prince moved forward, guided by the faint threads of truth she had left in her wake, piecing together a story no one else seemed willing to touch. And in the quiet corners of the castle, behind closed doors and moonlit windows, the bride began to sense a presence that was not demanding, not prying, but waiting, an unwavering patience that invited her to exist without fear. For the first time since arriving at the palace, she felt the possibility of trust, tentative and fragile, yet shimmering like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Elias did not yet know the full story, and she had not yet spoken a single word to reveal it. But the search for truth had begun, a journey of shadows and secrets, of discovery and revelation. And somewhere in the midst of fear and suspicion, both prince and bride felt the quiet stirring of something neither had expected, an unspoken connection, fragile as a thread, yet strong enough to pull them toward the heart of the mystery that would change their lives forever. The palace seemed alive with whispers, shadows stretching longer than the walls themselves. Prince Elias could feel it every time he walked through the halls. Eyes following, tongues murmuring, the weight of curiosity pressing down on every step. Yet amidst the scrutiny, the bride moved like a silent figure of mystery, untouched by the gossip, wrapped in the fragile armor of his silence. But something was changing. Small moments, unnoticed by others, began to weave a secret thread between them. In the quiet of the rose garden, where ivy twisted along stone walls and the air smelled faintly of earth and rain, Elias discovered her sitting alone on a stone bench, sketchbook balanced on her knees. He hesitated, unsure if he had the right to intrude, yet something stronger than caution pulled him forward. "May I sit?" he asked softly, voice low enough that the wind would carry it away from the nearest servant. Her eyes lifted, startled, and then slowly returned to her paper. She nodded, just barely, and he lowered himself beside her. Silence stretched between them, not awkward, but something heavier, charged with unsaid words and quiet understanding. She was drawing a tree, twisted and bare, its roots tangled like the strings of her own thoughts. He leaned closer, careful not to disturb her, and noticed a tiny figure crouched beneath the branches, herself, perhaps, or some younger version of her. The image stirred a lump in his throat. "You seem to carry a lot," Elias said gently. "I don't mean to pry. I just—" His words trailed off, because he didn't want to scare her, didn't want to push her back into the shell she had built so carefully. For the first time, she spoke, not aloud, but in a whisper almost to herself. "I have no choice to show yet." The words were fragile, trembling like glass, and he understood immediately. She was revealing just enough to let him see that she was beginning to trust him, even in the tiniest way. Days passed, and the small, stolen moments multiplied. They walked through the gardens in the early dawn, their steps quiet on dew-soaked stone. They lingered in the library, fingers brushing over books of art and music, sharing the silence of creation. And though she never spoke openly of her past, she began leaving him hints. A folded note tucked in a sketchbook, a carefully arranged flower, a glance that lingered too long to be casual. The court watched these moments with suspicion. Nobles whispered that the prince was being swayed, that the bride was a subtle threat, an enigma manipulating his heart. Some sought to exploit her, seeing her silence as weakness to be twisted. Others envied the delicate bond forming in secret, a connection built not on words, but on shared understanding, gestures, and patience. For Elias, the connection was real, more real than any proclamation or ceremony. He began to understand that her refusal to eat was not defiance. It was a symbol, a way of guarding herself against a world that had already betrayed her. And he did not flinch. He remained patient, present, willing to meet her in the space where words failed, where trust could grow slowly like a seed breaking through frozen soil. One evening, under the soft glow of lanterns in the garden, she handed him a folded piece of paper. On it, in delicate, trembling script, she had written a fragment of her story, a memory of being left alone, the ache of betrayal, the fear that her voice would never matter. He read it slowly, heart heavy, understanding more in that single page than months of conversation could have conveyed. He reached out, letting his fingers brush lightly against hers. She flinched, then allowed the contact, a fragile acknowledgement that he had entered a space no one else could. In the hush of the night, as the wind whispered through the ivy and the moon shone down on their quiet communion, a bond was forming, one that defied courtly expectations, the gossip of nobles, and the rigid walls of protocol. It was a connection built on empathy, patience, and understanding, a forbidden intimacy, fragile and secret, yet undeniable. And in that fragile thread of trust, both the prince and the bride began to feel something that neither could yet name: hope. The hope that even in a world that demanded appearances, demanded silence, a connection could bloom, delicate yet unbreakable. But as the palace slept under moonlight, shadows stirred in the corridors, and whispers of jealousy and ambition hinted that this fragile bond might not remain hidden for long. The connection they shared, tender and secret, had already begun to change the rhythm of the castle itself, and would soon demand choices neither were prepared to face. The castle walls, so grand and imposing, seemed suddenly smaller, as if the pressure inside had condensed into a tight, suffocating air. The bride's health, always delicate, had begun to falter. Her once graceful movements were now slow, careful, as if every step demanded more strength than she could summon. The candles flickered in the long halls, casting shadows that danced like specters, reflecting the tension that had settled over the palace. Physicians arrived daily, their faces pale with concern. They urged her to eat, offered remedies both medicinal and magical, yet she shook her head, eyes hollow, lips tight. Advisors whispered to the prince, pressing him to act, to intervene decisively. Some suggested confinement or force-feeding. Others hinted at removing her from the palace entirely. But Elias refused to give up, not on her, not on the fragile thread of trust they had begun to weave. One evening, the crisis reached its peak. The princess had been wandering the northern garden, away from all eyes, when she collapsed near the fountain. Elias, arriving just moments later, found her crumpled on the stone, pale and trembling, her breathing shallow. Panic clawed at his chest. He lifted her gently into his arms, his mind racing with fear he could hardly contain. "You must eat," he whispered, though he knew the words alone could not reach her. "You have to live, please." Her eyes flickered open briefly, and for a heartbeat, he saw it, the raw, unfiltered terror of someone who had lived too long in a world of betrayal. Then she looked away, closing herself off once more. That night, as the palace stirred with rumors of her condition, flashbacks began to haunt her mind, and the audience's view of her story. She remembered the cold, empty halls of her childhood home, the doors that never opened to laughter, the hands that pushed her away when she reached for comfort. She remembered a betrayal so deep that it had carved a permanent silence into her heart. A trusted caretaker, once a guiding figure, had turned against her. A family she believed she could rely upon had failed. These memories rose like ghosts, each one feeding the wall she had built between herself and the world, each one a reason she could not eat, could not trust, could not live fully in the light of others' expectations. Elias, witnessing her struggle, felt his own heart shatter. He paced the cold hallways, hands clenched, unable to rest, unable to sleep. He had always been patient, always kind, but now desperation gnawed at him. If she failed to eat, if her body gave in before her mind could heal, he feared the irreversible. And yet he also understood. Forcing her, pressing her, would only drive her further into herself. The palace's walls, once a place of grandeur, now felt like a cage of fear, whispers, and impending doom. Allies and enemies became visible in sharp contrast. Some palace staff, loyal to Elias, worked quietly to provide comfort, offering warm blankets, gentle meals, and whispered encouragement. Others sought to exploit the crisis, spreading stories that the bride's weakness reflected on the prince, questioning his judgment, and subtly stoking fear among nobles that his heart had led him astray. The tension grew, swirling around the palace in a storm of political intrigue, human fragility, and whispered secrets. In a moment of quiet despair, Elias found her sitting alone by the fountain once more, trembling. He knelt beside her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to face this alone," he said, voice low, almost breaking. "Let me help you. Let me see your pain, all of it." For the first time, she flinched, then leaned slightly into his touch, a tentative surrender, a fragile acknowledgement that she could allow someone in. Her hands, thin and pale, rested on his, and the tension in her shoulders softened, if only slightly. That gesture, small and silent, marked a turning point. And then, just as Elias began to hope, the flashbacks surged stronger, unbidden. She remembered the exact moment when trust had shattered, the words that cut deeper than any blade, the abandonment that had left her starved not only of food but of comfort, love, and safety. The memories were almost too much to bear, threatening to pull her back into the shadowed world she had long tried to escape. Elias held her tighter, whispering encouragement, refusing to let her fall, not physically, not emotionally. And in that fragile, trembling space between despair and hope, the first seeds of real connection began to grow. She did not yet eat. She did not yet speak fully of her trauma. But she allowed herself to be held, to exist in the presence of someone who would not leave her. The palace, still abuzz with fear and gossip, could not yet see this small victory. Yet in the quiet corners, in the moonlight reflected on the water, a critical truth began to emerge. Healing could not be forced. Trust, patience, and compassion were the only tools strong enough to reach her. And Prince Elias, desperate and exhausted though he was, had begun to understand that the path forward would demand all his heart and courage, and perhaps even more than that. As dawn broke over the castle, the first light glimmered on the bride's pale face, hinting at life still clinging, still fragile, still waiting. The breaking point had been reached, but the story was far from over. Somewhere in the shadows of pain, betrayal, and palace intrigue, the truth of her past lingered, waiting for the moment she could finally confront it, and for the prince to stand beside her when she did. The castle was unusually quiet that evening. Even the servants moved with hushed steps, sensing that something had shifted, an invisible tension threading through the corridors, wrapping around the grand halls, and settling like a heavy weight in the prince's chest. Prince Elias led the bride to a small chamber overlooking the northern garden, a private room where the moonlight spilled through tall windows, painting the floor in silver. She sank into a cushioned chair, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on a single point far beyond the garden wall. Elias knelt beside her, careful not to rush, careful to show patience rather than command. "You don't have to hide it anymore," he said softly. "Whatever it is, I want to understand. I will not turn away." Her hands trembled. Her lips quivered. And then, as if the floodgates had been held back too long, her voice emerged, not a whisper, not a murmur, but steady and raw with the weight of years she had carried alone. She spoke of childhood loneliness, of doors that never opened to comfort or laughter. She spoke of betrayal, of people she had trusted who had turned their backs, leaving her to face pain and isolation. She spoke of nights without food, not from hunger but from fear and control, a pattern repeated so many times that her body now recoiled from nourishment itself. Each word struck Elias like a dagger and a balm at the same time. He could feel the scars etched into her very being, and yet he also sensed the courage it took to speak them aloud. For years she had carried this burden alone, and now she was laying it bare in his presence. The prince reached out, taking her hands in his, careful, reverent. "I see you," he whispered. "I see all of it, and you are not alone anymore. I am here." For a long moment, she simply allowed him to hold her hands, the silence thick with emotion, the past and present colliding in the fragile light of understanding. Her chest rose and fell with the first true exhale she had allowed herself in years, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. Word of the revelation slowly spread through the palace. The courtiers who had whispered suspicion and gossip were stunned into silence. Some could not believe the depth of her suffering, others felt shame for ever doubting her. And yet, there were those who had quietly believed in her strength, and they stepped forward, offering tentative support, or mingling with respect. Elias remained by her side, steadfast and unwavering. He encouraged her to speak when she could, to share memories, fears, and emotions at her own pace. He reminded her gently that vulnerability was not weakness and that every word she spoke was a victory over the isolation that had once imprisoned her. And slowly, very slowly, the bride began to respond, not just in words, but in gestures. She reached for a cup of tea he offered, letting it touch her lips, a tentative acceptance of care. She allowed herself to look him in the eyes, to nod, to smile faintly. Each small act was a triumph, each tiny choice a reclaiming of a life. The palace, too, began to shift. Those who had doubted now watched in quiet reverence, understanding that strength often was a delicate mask. The once silent, fragile bride had revealed a profound truth, that the scars we carry are not shameful, but markers of resilience, and that sharing them does not weaken, but strengthens the bond between those who choose to listen. In that quiet chamber, under the soft silver light, a bond deeper than any ceremony or alliance was forged. It was a bond of trust, of understanding, and of hope. And though the palace walls still whispered with curiosity and intrigue, within the small circle of moonlight, the prince and bride had crossed a threshold, from silence to truth, from isolation to connection, and from fear to the first glimmer of healing. Elias held her hands a little tighter. "We will face the rest together," he said, voice firm yet gentle. "No one will take you away from me, from us. Not now." The bride's eyes filled with tears, not of shame or fear, but of release. For the first time, she felt seen, heard, and safe. The revelation had come, not through coercion, not through command, but through patience, understanding, and the unwavering presence of someone willing to wait for her truth. And as the moonlight bathed them both, the quiet promise hung in the air, that from this moment, nothing would be the same, and that together, they could face whatever shadows lingered in the palace, or in the heart. The first light of dawn spilled through the palace windows, painting the halls in soft gold. For the first time in months, the castle felt less like a fortress and more like a home. The bride, once silent and fragile, now moved with a tentative strength, her steps quieter but more assured. The small victories, sipping tea, touching a flower, speaking a full sentence, had begun to build a rhythm of life that had once seemed impossible. Prince Elias walked beside her in the gardens, hand brushing occasionally as if testing the weight of reality. The air smelled of earth and rain, and the sound of water from the fountain seemed like music, gentle and steady. The bride paused, her eyes following the flight of a bird in the morning sky. A soft smile, fleeting but genuine, touched her lips. Elias caught it and felt a warmth spread through his chest, the fragile beginnings of hope. Over time, she began to eat again. Not much at first, a bite of bread here, a sip of soup there, but each act was a declaration. With each meal, she reclaimed a part of herself she had hidden for so long, trusting Elias and, slowly, the world around her. He never rushed her. He never demanded more than she could give. Instead, he celebrated the smallest triumphs, his patience like a steady light guiding her back from shadow. The palace noticed the change. Courtiers who had whispered suspicion now watched in awe as she returned, piece by piece, to life. Servants smiled more readily. The doctors sighed with relief. Even the nobles, those who had once plotted or doubted, began to soften, recognizing the strength it took to heal. The bride's presence was no longer a fragile mystery, but a symbol of courage and resilience. Elias and the bride continued to spend time together, their bond deepening in quiet, ordinary moments. They wandered through the palace halls, shared books of art, and listened to music, her hand occasionally brushing his. They laughed softly at the simplicity of small joys, as if discovering life anew. Their love was no longer a secret thread, but a steady force, built on understanding, respect, and trust. In the rose garden, where their first secret conversations had bloomed, the bride paused beside a stone bench. "I never thought I could feel safe," she said softly. "Not after everything. But I feel it now. With you." Elias took her hands gently in his. You are safe, always, and we'll continue to face this world together. Even the palace itself seemed to change with her transformation. The shadows of gossip and intrigue began to fade, replaced by quiet admiration. Where once there had been fear and suspicion, now there was respect for her courage and for the patient heart of the prince who had refused to give up on her. One evening, they shared a simple meal in the quiet of their chamber. Bread, fruit, and warm tea. Ordinary things, yet extraordinary in the context of a journey. She ate slowly, deliberately, and he watched with quiet pride, each bite a victory over the fear and pain that had once ruled her life. The meal became a ritual, a symbol of her trust, her renewed strength, and her willingness to embrace life again. And in the gardens, where the fountain shimmered in the moonlight, they stood side by side, hands entwined. The first blossoms of spring had arrived, and with them, a sense of renewal. Their journey from silence and fear to connection and hope had not been easy, but it had been real, deep, and transformative. The bride, once the shadowed figure of whispered fears, had found her voice and her strength. Prince Elias, patient and steadfast, had guided her not through force but through compassion. Together, they had forged a bond that transcended fear, a bond that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. In that quiet moment, under the soft light of moon and stars, there was a sense of peace, a sense of life reclaimed. The palace walls, once heavy with whispers and doubt, now seemed filled with light, hope, and the promise of a future built not on obligation, but on love, trust, and courage. The story of the bride's silence, her struggle, and her eventual rebirth became a living testament, not just of personal healing, but of the transformative power of patience, empathy, and unwavering support. And for Prince Elias and his bride, the journey was only beginning, but it was a journey they would walk together, hand in hand, heart with heart, into the life they had finally reclaimed. The kingdom, once tense and shadowed by suspicion, now thrived under a quiet, steady light. The palace corridors, which had echoed with gossip and worry, were filled instead with laughter, music, and the hum of life. Gardens bloomed, fountains sparkled, and the people moved with a sense of peace that mirrored the change within their walls. Prince Elias and his bride walked through the palace hand in hand, no longer bound by fear or silence. Her smile was genuine, her eyes bright, carrying a strength that had been forged in the quiet crucible of struggle and trust. Together, they were more than royalty. They were symbols of patience, courage, and the power of compassion to heal even the deepest wounds. The bride, once fragile and silent, now stood tall, her presence a reminder that even the most broken hearts could be mended. The prince, steadfast and unwavering, had shown that love, when patient and understanding, could illuminate the darkest corners. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the kingdom glowed in golden light, there was a sense of triumph not born of conquest, but of resilience, healing, and connection. The palace, the couple, and the people had all been transformed, proof that courage, truth, and love could create a brighter, enduring future.